There is a figure the accord calls the tally, and for 100,000 years it has never lied. On the third morning above the mining moon of Coldharbor, reckoner Ilse Marinan came onto the bridge with her tea in both hands, glanced at the display out of 2 centuries of habit, and stopped walking. The tally had gone up. She stood very still, because a reckoner who reacts in front of the Orisk is a reckoner whose word is worth less by lunch, and she read the number a second time, and it was not a fault in the display. She had projected the fold for the 3rd day. It was the 3rd day. The number that measured how close this world was to laying down its arms was higher now than it had been when her fleet arrived, and it was still, very slowly, climbing. It should not have been possible for her to be looking at this. The tally is not a weapon. It is a number, carried live on the bridge of every Accord warship, and it does one thing: it predicts the exact moment a people will stop. Marinan had watched it fall on 206 worlds. She knew its behavior the way you know a tide. You applied pressure, and the number sank, and when it touched the floor the enemy laid down and asked for terms, and that was the war, and everyone went home. On a clean reckoning the tally reached the floor within an hour of her projection. She had built a life out of being right to the hour. She had never, not once in 2 centuries, watched the number climb. She set the tea down without drinking it. She would not pick it up again for a long time. Somewhere below her, under 12 kilometers of iron and dark, 4,000 people who had already lost were refusing, one at a time and without conferring, to understand that they had. This is the story of the first world that would not fold, and of the woman who came to name its number and went home without one. I want to tell it plainly, because everything that came after the Accord, everything, began as a blank space on a form. So let me show you the form, and the space, and the 2 people standing on either side of it who never once managed to see each other clearly. Wren Holloway measured a shift by the roof. You did not, in the deep galleries of Coldharbor, look at a clock. Clocks were for the surface, for the offices where the company men logged tonnage and the schoolteacher rang the children in. Down where Wren worked, at the black bottom of 14 Gallery, time was a thing you read off the stone above your head, the way it ticked and settled after a cut, the fine grit that sifted down when the moon's slow tremors came through, the moment the props began to talk. A good foreman heard the roof the way a mother hears a child in another room, not listening, exactly, but never not listening either. The deep had its own weather, and Wren had learned to read it before she had properly learned to read anything else. There was the wet cold that came up through the boot soles and the flooded lower drifts, different from the dry cold of the upper galleries, which tasted of dust and old blasting powder no matter how many years had passed since anyone had last touched a charge. There was the particular orange of the lamps against black rock, a color that existed nowhere on the surface and that Wren, on the rare trips up top, always found faintly wrong, too clean, too white. There was the sound of a drill biting good rock, a solid unhesitating note, and the sound of a drill biting rock that was about to let go, a note with a catch in it that you felt in your back teeth before your mind had named it. 14 Gallery ran deep and long, following an ore vein that had been rich enough, once, to be worth the company's while. Now it was worth nothing to the company and everything to the people still living inside it, which was its own kind of arithmetic that no reckoner would ever be asked to do. The roof had been talking more than she liked. Bolt it and move, she said to the crew, and put her own shoulder to the drill, because a foreman who stands back is a foreman nobody follows into a bad heading. Her daughter would have said she liked the work too much, and her daughter would have been right, and her daughter was up top in the shelter with the other children and the old people, which was the only reason Wren could put her whole self into the stone. You could not carry a child down here. You carried the thought of one, and it made you careful, and careful was how you came home. Foreman. That was Dell, 17 and new, his lamp shaking a little. The line to 6 is dead again. Then it's dead, Wren said. We'll run a runner-up at shift change. That's the third line today. I can count, Delaware. She said it without heat. She had counted. She had counted the dead lines the way she counted everything, which was quietly and without letting it show on her face, because a foreman's face was a roof too, and the crew read it the same way. 3 phone lines to the upper galleries gone since morning. The hoist running slow. The ventilation doing something she did not have a word for, a kind of hesitation in the air, as if the moon had taken a breath and was thinking about whether to let it out. She knew what it was. Everyone in the deep knew and nobody said. 22 days ago the sky had filled with the ships of the Accord, and a voice smooth as poured oil had told Coldharbor to surrender itself and its or to the good order of the galaxy, and the company men in their offices had drafted a careful reply about contracts and compensation. For most of those 22 days the reply had been the whole of the war, offers refined and resent, deadlines set and quietly moved again, the ships doing nothing overhead but existing, patient as weather. Wren had almost let herself believe patience was a kind of mercy. Then, not many days passed, the first orbital strike had turned the whole east field and the men standing in it into a light you could read a manifest by. After that there were no more careful replies. After that there was only the deep, and the roof, and the work. Mind the roof, Wren said, to Dell, to the crew, to herself. It was what she always said. It meant a dozen things. It meant we are still here. It meant do your job. It meant, on the worst days, I cannot promise you anything but this next hour, so let us cut this next hour well. They bolted it and moved. The roof settled. Down the heading, past the reach of the lamps, the dark went on the way it always had, older than the company, older than the Accord, older than the idea that anyone might come from the sky and put a price on a person. Wren did not know it, cutting that heading, but she was the last foreman in Coldharbor still running a crew. She did not know that the reason the lines were dying was that there was less and less above her still able to answer them. She thought she was one gallery among 14. She thought the war was a thing happening to all of them together. The Accord thought so too. That was the whole of their mistake, and it was about to cost them the galaxy. A reckoner is not a general. Ilsa Marinon had never given an order to fire in her life and would have found the suggestion vulgar. A reckoner is a mathematician of surrender, a priest of a single equation, and the equation is this: every thinking species, hurt past a certain point, stops. The point differs. The Velthani, her own people, fold early and with dignity, at the loss of perhaps a tenth of themselves, because they are old and see no glory in the arithmetic of ruin. The Orisk hold longer, out of doctrine. The Sibren, who are 400 billion and share a single spread-out mind, fold almost at once, because pain in one of them is pain in all and no swarm can bear that for long. But every species folds. The number varies. The fact does not. It is the oldest law the Accord knows, older than the Accord itself, and reckoners are the ones who calculate it to the decimal and hand the generals a date. Marinon had handed the fleet the date for Coldharbor before they ever left the seam. Third day. She had reckoned worlds like this 120 times over, resource colonies, hard populations, no fleet worth the word, and they folded like the others, only later, because the miners and the frontier hands took more killing before the signal moved through them. But it always moved. You broke a fraction of them in the right place, publicly, and the break spread through the rest the way a crack spreads through ice, and by the 7th part lost the whole sheet gave at once and it was over. A clean fold had a shape, and every reckoner learned to read it before she learned to write her own name in Velthani script. The line did not simply fall. It stuttered first, a fine tremor in the projection as the first isolated units broke and their small collapses registered, a shift the display rendered as a soft double chime, once for the break, once for the guild's confirmation that the break was real and not noise. Then, if the world was going to fold, the tremor steadied into a slope, smooth and almost gentle, the mathematics of a population giving way to itself, one unit deciding for the whole. Marinan had read that shape on 206 worlds and could have drawn it from memory, the stutter, the steadying, the long graceful surrender of the slope. She checked for it now the way another woman might check a pulse. The fleet had struck the east field on her first day prescription. Textbook. The signal should have moved. Now it was the third morning and the tally had gone up, and Marinan stood on the bridge of the Accord flagship and did the thing she was famous for, which was to refuse to look away from a number she did not like. Reckoner. Fleet Marshal Cedron Call was Orisk, grey at the crest, and he had fought beside her word for 60 years and trusted it the way you trust a floor. The projection was the third day. I am aware of my own projection, Marshal. Then the world is late. Worlds are not late, Marinan said. Late is what we call it when we are wrong about the reason. A world folds when the signal reaches enough of it. If it has not folded, the signal has not reached enough of it. So I am asking a smaller question than late. I am asking why the signal is not moving. Call considered this. He was not a stupid soldier, the Accord did not keep stupid soldiers 60 years, and he had felt, these 3 days, the first cold threat of a thing he had no name for either. We struck the east field in full view, he said. 40,000 of them saw it. On any other world On any other world the 40,000 who saw it would have carried it to the 4,000 who did not, and the 4,000 would have carried it lower, and by now the deep galleries would be sending up men with their hands open. Marinan looked at the moon on the display, a dirty coin, veined with the heat lines of its shafts. They are not sending up men with their hands open. They are sending up nothing. The deep has gone quiet. Quiet is good. Quiet is a beaten world. Quiet, said Marinan, is a world I cannot read. And I have never in 206 reckonings been unable to read a world. She was not afraid yet, not on the third day. She was affronted, the way a great surgeon is affronted by a body that will not do what bodies do. The fear came later, and it came slowly, and it came dressed as a blank box on a form. Open me a channel to the deep, she said. If they will not surrender to a fleet, perhaps they will explain themselves to a reckoner. I would like to ask them a question. What question? How many of their dead they are willing to accept, Marinan said, before they stop. It is the first question. It is always the first question. She almost smiled, and it was not a cruel smile, it was the smile of someone about to be shown the edge of the world and mistaking it for the middle. Every species can answer it. Let us hear their number, and I will tell you the day. The company man came down to 14 gallery at what should have been shift change, and Wren knew before he opened his mouth that something above had come apart, because company men did not come down. They sent runners. They sent orders on paper. They stayed in the light. His name was Orsipal, and he had been the tonnage clerk, and he had the grey look of a man who had been counting something worse than ore. They want to talk to you, he said. Who does? The Accord. He stopped. There's a voice. On the company set, the long-range one. It's been asking for whoever runs the deep. I told them the superintendent. He swallowed. The superintendent was in the east field, Wren. I know where the superintendent was. Everyone knew where the superintendent was. He was part of the light you could read a manifest by. Why me? Because you're the last foreman with a live crew and a working line to the surface, Orsapal said, and there it was, the shape of the thing, the shape Wren had been reading off the dead phone lines all day and refusing to say. She thought of the 14 galleries the way you think of your own fingers, without counting them, and she understood, standing in the drift with her lamp throwing Orsapal's shadow long up the wall, that some of the fingers were gone. She did not ask how many. A foreman's face is a roof. She held it up. Put me on the set, she said. They walked up through the workings, and Wren read the moon as she went, and the moon told her the story her mouth would not. 3 gallery, dark and silent, its blast doors down. 7, a smell of burning she knew and hated. The long inclines where the ore cars should have been running and were not. By the time they reached the company office and its long-range set she had counted without meaning to, the way she always did, and the count sat in her chest like swallowed stone. Of 14 galleries, she could put a name to 4 that still had anyone left in them at all, for where a lamp still moved somewhere in the dark, where a knock on the rock still got a knock back. But a gallery with people trapped in it is not the same as a gallery still working, and by the time Orsapal found her she understood, without anyone saying it, that hers was the only one of the 4 still doing both, still cutting, still bolting, still running a crew, instead of a huddle of frightened people keeping each other alive in the dark and waiting to see which came first, rescue or the roof. She had gone down that morning one crew in a mine full of crews. She came up the last light in a house going dark, and nobody had told her, because the phone lines had died one at a time, quietly, without letting it show. The set hissed. Orsapal worked the dials. And then a voice came out of it, and Wren understood at once why the company man had gone gray, because it was the most reasonable voice she had ever heard. It was not a monster's voice. It was worse. It was the voice of someone who had done this many times and found it tedious. "This is Reckoner Ilsa Marinan of the Accord," the voice said. "I am speaking to the person who directs the deep workings. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that it is asked in good faith and that your honest answer will shorten what is happening to you. Will you answer it?" Wren looked at the set. She looked at Orsapal, gray. She thought of her daughter in the shelter, who named the machines because machines that had names were easier to trust. She thought of the roof. "Ask," she said. "How many of your dead," said the reasonable voice, "are you willing to accept before you stop?" And Wren Holloway, foreman of the last live gallery on a dying moon, did not understand the question. Not the way you fail to understand the hard word. She understood every word in it. What she could not find was the place the question was supposed to fit, the shape in her it was meant to press, because there was no number. There was her crew, and the next hour, and the roof, and her daughter, and the dead she already carried and would carry to her own grave, each one of them a private thing, hers, not tradable, not a total. The reckoner was asking her to add up her dead and read off a sum past which she would stop being herself. And Wren looked at the question the way you look at a tool for a job that does not exist. "I don't dash," she started, and stopped, because a foreman does not say "I don't understand" into a set the whole surface can hear. She tried again. "You're asking me how many people you have to kill before I give you the mine." "Yes," said the reckoner, and there was, for the first time, a thread of something almost like relief in the smooth voice, the relief of a teacher whose slow student has finally reached the question. "Yes. That is precisely what I am asking. Every people has a number. Tell me yours, and I will tell you when this ends, and I give you my word it will be sooner than you fear." Wren was quiet for a moment. Up the incline, the roof of 7 gallery let go with a sound like the moon clearing its throat, and dust came down the shaft, and somewhere in it were people she had eaten lunch beside for 15 years. "There isn't one," she said. A pause on the Marinan closed the channel and sat with the human's words for a long time before she did anything with them. "You're waiting for a bell we don't have." A crude sentence, roughened by fright but perfectly clear in the human's own tongue. And yet Marinan, who had spent 200 years inside the mathematics of the fold, felt the sentence go into her like a splinter goes in, small, and then impossible to leave alone. She went to the ship's copy of the Doctrine of the Yield, the founding text, the book every reckoner memorizes before they are permitted to reckon a single life. Every reckoner candidate spent a full year of the guild schooling reciting it from a physical copy exactly like this one, bound in Belthani gray, because a doctrine you have only ever touched through a screen is a doctrine you can be argued out of, and the guild did not intend its priesthood ever to be argued out of anything. Marinan had recited it standing, the way all of them did, in a hall with 200 other candidates, and had believed every word of it the way you believe the ground under a floor. She had not opened it in decades. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. But she opened it now, on the bridge, in front of Call, because she needed to read one passage with her eyes and not from memory, needed to see whether it said what she had always assumed it said or whether she had, for 200 years, been reading a thing into it that was not there. She found the passage under the heading that every child of the accord can recite, on the nature of the signal. She read it aloud, low, so that only Call could hear. A species does not surrender as individuals. It surrenders as a body. When loss, pain, or terror passes the threshold in a sufficient portion of the population, that portion emits the signal, in the Velthani a settling of the blood, in the Oriska change in the crest scent, in the Sibrin a note in the shared mind, and the signal moves through the rest, and the rest fold, because no social creature can hold its resolve against the felt despair of its own kind. This is the yield. It is not weakness. It is the mercy that a thinking species carries for itself, so that it need not be destroyed to the last to be defeated. In simple terms, no one has to convince all of them. You have only to break enough of them in the right place, and they will carry the breaking to each other. Marinan stopped reading. You have only to break enough of them in the right place, and they will carry the breaking to each other. She went back to the first line, then the last. When she closed the book, one finger stayed between the pages, preserving the place as if the sentence might change while she spoke. It did not. "Marshal," she said. "I have made an error. I want to name it precisely, because if I am right about the error then everything the fleet does next is wrong." Call waited. That was his gift, the waiting. "The yield is not a law of pain," Marinan said. "I have thought, my whole life, that it was a law of pain, that each species has a quantity of suffering past which it stops. But that is not what the doctrine says. Read it again. The yield is a law of togetherness. A species folds because its despair becomes a shared command. Break enough of them and the rest feel it and give way. The signal is the whole mechanism. The number I calculate, the famous number, the day I hand you, it is not a measure of how much pain a people can bear. It is a measure of when shared grief makes the decision for them." "They are the same thing," Call said. "They have been the same thing," said Marinan, "on every world the accord has ever taken. Because every species we have ever catalogued carries a fold signal through its despair. It has never once mattered that pain and surrender were different things, because we never met a people in whom they came apart." She looked at the moon. "The human on the set just told me that in her people they come apart. Their despair does not become a shared command. There is no fold signal. You can break them in the right place in full view of the rest and the rest will grieve, but grief will not make the decision for them, because grief in a human is a room each person must enter alone. The bridge was quiet. On the display the tally sat, and as they watched it moved, and it moved up. If that is true, Carl said slowly, then breaking a portion of them in the right place does not do anything, Marinon said. It kills that portion. It moves no signal, because there is no signal. Every strike we make removes the people we struck and leaves everyone else to decide again for themselves. We are not folding this world, Marshall. We are subtracting it. One person at a time, forever, until there are none, and the last one will be as unfolded as the first. She heard herself and stopped, because she had reached, out loud and without meaning to, the sentence that the whole rest of her life would be an argument with. There is no number that makes them stop. There is only a number that makes them all dead. And those are not the same number, and I have spent 200 years unable to tell the difference, because until today it never came up. Down in the deep, Wren did the only thing she knew how to do with a thing too large to hold, which was to break it into shifts. She could not save the moon. She had known that, in the honest back room of herself, since the East Field. She could not even save the 3 other galleries with anyone left alive in them, the ones holding on lamps and nerve and nothing else. She could hear, in the roof, that the accord had stopped striking from orbit and started coming down, and men in the black are not saved by foremen. What she could do was smaller, and it was the only thing that was hers. She could get the ones nearest her out of the deep and up to the shelter, where her daughter was, where the children were, because a shelter with more people in it was a shelter someone might, someday, decide was worth sparing, and a gallery with people trapped in it was only a grave that had not finished closing. So she ran the retreat the way she ran a shift. Bolt it and move. She sent Dell up first with the youngest of the crew, over his objections, because Dell wanted to be brave and Wren needed him alive, and those were, today, the same order. She stayed at the bottom and fed the crews up the incline one at a time, reading the roof, holding the face, and when a man wanted to stop and sit down in the dark she did not give him a speech about the accord or the mine or the species. She said his name and she said mind the roof, and she put a tool back in his hands, because that was the whole of what she had, and it turned out, on Coldharbor, to be enough. Not enough to win. Enough to keep going 1 more hour, which is a different thing, and which the accord had no column for. The incline out of 14 ran the better part of 2 kilometers before it met the transfer drift, and it climbed the whole way, a grade the ore cars took easily and a body did not. Wren walked it a dozen times that day and never once let herself run it, because a foreman who runs is a foreman who has decided something, and she had not decided anything yet except the next hour. She carried a man with a crushed hand on her shoulder for the last stretch of it because his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him, and she talked to him the whole way about nothing, about the good vein they had hit in the spring, about his sister's wedding, because a mind with somewhere else to be is a mind that keeps walking. The dust never settled up there. It hung in the lamplight in a way that made the whole incline look, from a distance, like it was slowly, patiently, breathing. The old ones were the worst of it and the best of it both, slower on the grade, needing a hand at the elbow, and never once, not one of them, asking to be left. She thought about her husband while she worked, because the work was in her hands and left her mind free, and her mind went where it always went now, which was to Tam. Tam had died the day after the East Field, on the surface, doing something brave and useless with a cutting torch and a landing skiff, and Wren had not been there, and she carried it. She carried it alone. That was the thing the reasonable voice on the set had not been able to find in her, and Wren, if you had explained to her what the reckoner was learning 400 kilometers up, would not have understood why it was a revelation. Of course she carried Tam alone. Who else would carry him? The crew had their own dead. Dell had a father in the East Field. Grief was not a thing you pooled. You each took your own down into your own dark and you cut the next heading with it on your back, and if you were lucky the work was hard enough that for a whole hour at a time you did not put it down only because you could not remember you were holding it. She did not feel the resolve of the moon in her. She felt Tam, and her daughter's name, and the roof. That was all any of them felt, their own small unbearable thing, and the next hour. 4,000 people, 4,000 separate dooms, each carried privately, none of them adding up to a common command, none of them ringing a bell. It was the most human thing in the galaxy and it was about to break 100,000-year-old empire, and not one of them did it on purpose. They were not heroes. A hero decides. They were something the Accord had no word for and no defense against. They were people who had simply never learned how to all stop at the same time, because no one had ever needed to teach them, because the lesson had never once come up in the whole history of the species. Their strength was in absence. You cannot break an absence. You can only fill it with your soldiers, one gallery at a time, and count your own dead while you do, and wonder, if you are a reckoner with any honesty left, what exactly it is you think you are winning. Next shift, Wren told the last of her crew, sending them up. It meant we are still here. It meant do your job. It meant, that day, I have nothing to promise you but that I will be the last one up, so climb, and let me read the roof for you one more hour. Then she turned and went back down toward 14 alone, to bring up the pump's log and the tally of who was still below, because a foreman brings up her count, always, even at the end, especially at the end. Even when the count is only grief, you bring it up. You do not leave it in the dark. Some days later, far from Coldharbor, in the pale halls of the Velthani homeworld where the reckoners keep their guild, a junior archivist named Corin Aumbre logged the report Marinan had sent after leaving the moon and did not, at first, think anything of it. Reports came in from every front, thousands a year, and Aumbre's task was only to file them by the standard form, which had not changed in 90,000 years and had a place for everything, the world, the fleet, the projected fold, the actual fold, and near the bottom, in a small box that the form treated as the most routine field of all, a single line that read fold signal, observed at. Every report ever filed had a time in that box. It was, in a sense, the whole point of the report, the moment the signal moved, the moment the war became a formality. Aumbre had filed 40,000 of them and had never once seen the box left blank, any more than a birth record leaves blank the fact that the child breathed. A reckoning without a fold signal was a contradiction in terms, like a completed circle that did not close. The report from Coldharbor came in flagged for the guild's attention, filed personally by reckoner Ilsa Marinan, whose name Aumbre knew the way everyone in the guild knew it, 206 worlds, never wrong. Aumbre opened it expecting the cleanest form in the archive. The box was empty. Not zero. Not pending. Empty, and beside it, in Marinon's own careful hand, a note where no note had ever been written, no fold signal was observed because none exists in this species. The doctrine of the yield does not apply here. Recommend the guild convene. Aumbre checked the seal, then compared the empty field with the reports on either side of it. He did not convene the guild. He was junior, it was not his place, and there would be, in the halls of the certain, a great and comfortable machinery of reasons why one strange report from one tired reckoner did not mean the floor of the world was a lid. But he kept the report. He did not know why. He would keep the reports that followed. And one day, a long way from that afternoon, an old archivist would lay them side by side and read the empty boxes as a single sentence, and understand what the guild had spent his whole life refusing to convene about. That was ahead. For now there was only a junior clerk, and a blank space on a form, and the first cold of it. The box stayed empty. It would keep staying empty. That, in the end, was the whole war. Before she sent that report, Marinan went down to Coldharbor herself, which reckoners do not do. Coll fought her on it and she overruled him with the only argument that worked, which was that she could not reckon a world she would not look at, and that if the doctrine of the yield was wrong, if she was about to send a report to the guild that would, if believed, unmake the intellectual foundation of the accord, then she would not send it on the strength of a voice on a set. She would put her own long pale hands on the thing that could not be true and be sure. They had taken the surface by then. It had cost them. Marinan walked through it in her reckoner's grey with 2 orisk at her shoulders, and she made herself look, because looking was the discipline of her order and she would not disgrace it now. She saw the shelter where the children and the old had been kept, and it was intact, because even the accord does not strike a shelter, and the people in it looked at her with the flat exhausted eyes of the newly conquered, and she looked for the thing she had come to find and did not find it. On any other world these faces would have carried the fold. The despair would have been in the air, a settling, a giving way, the felt surrender of a broken people. She had walked through 100 such crowds and felt it every time, the way you feel a room's grief at a funeral. She felt nothing here. Not defiance, she could have understood defiance, defiance is a signal too. She felt the absence of a collective command. Each face was closed around its own private ruin, but the people still held one another upright. 1,000 people in a shelter, sharing food, names, and grief, while each remained responsible for the decision to continue. The despair was total and it did not become surrender. It sat in each of them like water in separate cups. They could stand beside one another and carry one another, but no amount of breaking would pour those cups into a single order to stop, because the full channel every other species in the galaxy was born with had simply, in these people, never grown. An old woman in the shelter watched Marinan come and said, in accented accord, without heat, "You can stop now, if you like. It won't make us stop. But you can." And Marinan, who had been spoken to by the conquered on 206 worlds and had heard every kind of plea and curse and bargain, had never once been offered that, the strange flat mercy of it, the observation that the conqueror was free to stop even though the conquered could not be made to. It was not a threat and it was not surrender. It was just true, and the old woman knew it was true, and that was the worst part. They brought her to Ren last. They had found the foreman at the bottom of 14 gallery with a pump log in one hand and a written count in the other, exactly where a foreman would be, and they had brought her up because Marinan asked for the one who had spoken on the set. Ren stood in the ruin of the company office, filthy, swaying a little with a tiredness past sleeping, and the 2 women looked at each other across a gap that neither of them would ever cross, the reckoner who had come to name a number and the foreman who did not have one, and Marinan understood that this, the not crossing, was the true shape of everything now. She would file her report. The guild would read it or refuse to. But standing in the office she already knew, with the cold certainty that had made her the best of her order, that the accord had met the one thing its whole machine could not process, and that the machine would not believe it, and that the not believing would be the beginning of the end. Because you cannot govern by the yield a people who do not yield. You can only, eventually, decide to make an example of them. And an example, made of a people with no fold signal, is not a lesson. It is just a larger grave, and a louder proof that the box stays empty. "I have one more question," Marinan said to Ren. "Not the first one. A different one. May I ask it?" Ren looked at her. "You're the voice from the set." "I am." "You stopped," Ren said. "When I told you. You stopped striking from orbit. I advised the Marshal to stop, and he did." "Why?" Marinan was quiet. It was, she realized, the same question the old woman had answered for her without being asked. Because you told me the truth, she said, and the truth was that continuing would not do the thing I was continuing in order to do. It would only kill you. I am not, she paused, and chose the word with a reckoner's care, I am not sentimental. But I do not kill for no result. That is not mercy. It is only arithmetic. There was no result to be had. She looked at the count in Ren's blackened hand. What is that? My tally, Ren said. Who's still down? Who we lost? She said it the way she said everything, flat, a foreman's roof of a face, and only her hand shook, a little, around the paper. I bring it up. You always bring it up. And Ilsa reckoner of the Accord, looked at the human's tally, a list of private names, each one a cup of water that would never be poured out into any other, a grief that added up to nothing because it was never meant to add up, because it was carried and not calculated, and she thought of her own tally, the great live number on the bridge that had never lied in 100,000 years and had just, above this moon, told its first truth that no one wanted, which was that some worlds have no floor. Yes, Marinan said. You always bring it up. And she did not ask her second question after all, because she found she already knew the answer, and the answer was that there wasn't one, and that there was never going to be one, and that she was going to spend the rest of her long life being the only person in the Accord who had looked at the empty box and believed it. They let the shelter live. Ren never knew exactly why. Perhaps it was arithmetic, as the reckoner said, no result to be had in killing the last of a worked-out moon. Perhaps the report Marinan filed bought a season's hesitation somewhere in the pale halls of the guild. Perhaps it was only that the fleet had a schedule and Coldharbor was no longer on it. The Accord did not explain itself to Foreman. The ships thinned in the sky over some days, and then one morning they were gone, and the survivors of Coldharbor came up out of the shelters into a scoured surface under an empty sky and began, because there was nothing else to do and because it was in them to do it, the next shift. Ren found her daughter in the shelter, thin and gray and alive, and did not weep, because a foreman's face is a roof even then, especially then, and held her, and over the child's head looked at the ruined field where the ships had been and did the thing she always did, which was to count. So many gone. So many still here. She brought the count up out of the dark and set it down in the light and did not let it crush her, because a count is only a count until you decide it is a verdict, and Ren Holloway had decided a long time ago, without ever putting words to it, that she would not hand anyone, not the company, not the Accord, not grief itself, the authority to tell her the day she was allowed to stop. She did not know she had been part of something. She thought a fleet had come and killed a great many people she loved and then, for reasons of its own, gone away. She was right, as far as it went. What she could not see, from the bottom of it, was that the reason it went away was her flat true sentence into a company set, there isn't a number, you're waiting for a bell we don't have, and that the sentence had gone up through the sky and into a book 90,000 years old and cracked something in it that would never close again. Years later, when the whole galaxy was coming apart and the histories were being written, no history would find her. The foreman of 14 Gallery does not appear in the record of how the Accord fell. She would not have wanted to. She would have said she just ran her shift and brought up her count and got her daughter home, which was true, and was also, it turned out, the thing that no empire built on the yield could survive, a person who kept going, alone, carrying her own dead, past every number a reckoner could name, for no reason grander than that stopping had simply never been on the list of things she knew how to do. Next shift, she told her daughter, on the scoured surface, under the empty sky. And they went to find the others, and they began. I have told you this was the story of the first world that would not fold, and it was. But I want to end on the smaller thing, the true thing, the thing that outlived the empire. The Accord believed, for 100,000 years, that it understood surrender. It had a number for every people, a book that had never been wrong, a small box on a form that always got a time written in it. The box was the Empire. As long as the box got filled, the galaxy stayed quiet, and the reckoners handed the generals their dates, and everyone went home. It was, in its terrible way, a kind of mercy, a machine for defeating a people without destroying them, built on the one law they thought was written into thinking itself, that despair, in a living thing, spreads. And then a mining moon at the edge of nowhere sent up a foreman with a pump log and no number, and a reckoner with 200 years of being right looked into a shelter full of the conquered and felt, for the first time, nothing move. And she went home and she wrote, in a hand that shook only a little, in a box that had never once been empty in 90,000 years, no full signal was observed, because none exists. The box stayed empty. That is the whole of it. Not a fleet, not a weapon, not a hero. A blank space on a form, and a species that had never learned to all stop at the same time, and a great certain empire that would spend everything it had, in the years to come, trying and failing to make that blank space mean something other than what it meant. It meant they could not be measured. And a galaxy that runs on measurement had just met the unmeasured, and did not yet know that it had already lost. Wren Holloway ran her next shift. Ilsa Marinon filed her report. And a junior archivist a long way away kept a copy he could not explain, and waited, without knowing he was waiting, for the reports that would follow.